Have you ever heard of the word exponential growth? It's a pattern of growth that shows greater increases with passing of time, creating a curve of exponential function. Here on the graph, you see linear growth in red, cubic growth in blue, and exponential growth in green. This phenomenon happens in technology, economy, and society when there is optimal growth conditions, and it's happening now. I didn't prepare anything for this episode with futurist authors Julie and Michael other than reading their book Living in the Age of the Jerk. It's basically a conversation amongst ourselves, talking about the world we live in this exponential growth. So stick around to the end.
Future Design Podcast.
Well, thank you very much for being on our Future Design Podcast. I read your book, Living in the Age of the Jerk. I found that name quite interesting because initially I thought about, who's going to be the jerk, rather than the word jerk as in terms of acceleration of technology and the world we live in. I love to talk about a broad sense, and it kind of gives me a little bit of despair trying to cover all the topics. So let's just narrow down to a certain topic that I found quite interesting, especially from the beginning of part 2, where we talk about we're heading towards the age of abundance. Jeremy Rifkin, I read his book before called Zero Marginal Cost, and that stuck with me quite a lot, and thought about a lot about the future where we're going towards is that we're going to have so much abundance, and the price of everything is going to be so much cheaper than it is now that we wouldn't really need to really pay for anything pretty much anymore, at least for material things. And let's kind of dive down into your views on this kind of topic.
Sure. Michael, do you want to start? You have pretty strong opinions on that.
So. Yeah, by all means. I think there are two ways in which that could happen. One is simply through making more efficient use of what we've already got. So, for example, if we, as autonomous cars develop and we see a sort of the rise of car sharing, so you'll see the kind of the Uber model applied to autonomous cars, then all of a sudden we won't need so many cars to meet our transport needs. So the cost of individuals will not need to invest so much money. They won't need, the car is one of the most expensive things you'll ever buy. But if you just buy it on demand, you hire it on demand, and you don't have to pay for a cost of a driver because it's autonomous, then all of a sudden you can meet your needs to travel for a much lower cost than it currently costs. Linked to that, you've got the rise of remote working, for which COVID has had a significant impact upon that, and remote working is not going away. Conversations like this are going to become more and more common, and again, that means we don't need to spend as much money as we used to spend on transport, on traveling about, because we can do it from our home. So that's one of the factors, and then linked with that, you've got the Internet of Things as well, and the Internet of Things rather combined with AI, which suddenly means that it'd be possible to make demand and supply match each other a lot more efficiently than they do at the moment. So at the moment, a huge percentage of the food that we buy isn't eaten; it's wasted. There's an awful lot of products that are bought and then they're overproduced. Then intelligent use of technology can, by introducing a sort of a pricing structure, can make sure that supply and demand, or demand what we really need, really matches each other. So that's one respect that they can do that. And then the other respect it can do that is through the technology itself, producing things in a much greater quantity than was currently possible, such as, for example, CRISPR-Cas9, editing DNA. Julien, do you want to take it over from there?
I think you've covered a lot of the bases in relation to how we think technology means that we'll become more efficient in the use of existing usage. I think we'll find we'll become more able to be more efficient in relation to the consumption we have as well. For example, energy. In so much that, for example, the system of the central grid providing electricity to everybody else will slowly, I think, vanish as we are able to produce energy ourselves for our own proper consumption. We're already seeing that with solar power and with certain houses having their own solar power capacity. Some of them be able to resell some of their capacity to the major grid, etc. So yes, we're going more efficient from that perspective. But I think it's sensible that we start looking at it that way, because we've got to remember that if science advances are such as Michael's been trying to portray, we also need to recognize that we human beings are living longer, able to live longer, and therefore our continuous need and demand for resources will continue to grow, and if we're not careful. So I think what Michael are trying to show is that there is a way of not necessarily painting a dark picture that says we'll continue destroying the planet through our insatiable resource requirements. We can actually counter that by the appropriate usage of technology through renewables, as we know, which is a core topic these days of the climate change debate, but also the efficient way in which we move energies. There's super materials out there that allow us, effectively, when we mastered how they work, to be able to move energy from one point to another virtually with no loss. And therefore, you can see, therefore, you're producing less energy to achieve the same desired outcome the other end. So that's really some of the themes that trigger this conversation around, yes, we could end up with an age of plenty where literally we can do whatever we want without necessarily having to earn an absolute fortune to achieve this, which is currently what is I guess, the scenario these days, in terms of if you want the latest technology, you need to be either the inventor or very wealthy. We should down the road find that actually every member of this planet is able to access these resources in a more efficient way, rather than necessarily owning these resources.
Yeah. Also, because just one other thing I could say, when you think about it, there are certain, already we're in a position when there are certain occasions when the marginal cost of energy is practically zero, because when the sun is shining brightly and when it's quite windy, then we generate way more energy than we possibly could use. Now at the moment that's a problem, because it means that we have too much energy at some times of the day and not enough energy at other times of the day. But what the combination of things like AI can do is it can channel that energy when the marginal cost is zero into applications that are not that time sensitive. So you could use it for things like heating, storage heaters, for example, or neural networks. Neural networks is very energy intensive. Well, you time it so that the neural networks are encouraged to only operate when the cost of energy is very, very low, or the big one, the one that is a real game changer, is water desalination. The big cost with that is the cost of energy. Well, if there are you don't have to have the water, doesn't have to be subjected to water desalination all the time. It just needs to be subjected to it some of the time. Well, if AI can intelligently say, right now the conditions are optimal for that, let's turn on the water desalination, and then as it becomes less windy or less sunny, turn it off, then all of a sudden you've got opportunities emerge that don't currently exist.
And we could also talk about regenerative technologies as well. So in your book, we've read many places about 3D printing as well. So
absolutely.
Can we take, let's say, a glass or a plastic and what we've used already and put that into a 3D printer, let it melt, and then create another different type of cup or a plate or whatever we need to, so that we can recycle things and we don't have to dig so much from the ground every single time? Because we know that these clean technologies, whether they're solar panels, we are still going to dig from the earth to get these materials. So can we use the already used materials and regenerate it over and over again, so that we can have a sustainable consumption of resources, rather than as you said, like an insatiable appetite to keep digging out of the ground a lot more?
So I think you're right. Certainly, we are, as a society, technologically getting more adept at the repurposing or the recycling, or the right term is, of already used materials in order to repurpose them either as in its existing shape or as a new shape. But I think it's probably worth looking at the second half of that game, which is the 3D printing, not necessarily with a view to repurposing an existing product, but potentially with a view to reducing the energy required to actually get that particular product, so to speak, or let's call it a product for the sake of the conversation, from the manufacturing point to the end user. And therefore, how do you almost negate that distance, largely because that particular additive manufacturing, as it's called, 3D printing, is actually in the same location as the end user. And that has very large ramifications from making pieces of hardware as it relates to spare parts for, let's say, a complicated machine. Let's say a pump on an oil rig. Do you really need to go through all the process of getting that small bolt to the oil rig, or can that oil rig actually print its own spare part to actually repair the machine it needs repairing, all the way through to drug manufacturing? Technically, it is very feasible to find ourselves in a scenario where, in fact, the drug is only being manufactured by the pharmacy, for argument's sake, if we assume the pharmacy maybe still exists, in situ as the patient comes in, or as the patient requests it. I presume the patient will no longer come into the pharmacy; it'll get delivered somewhere or another. But you know what I mean? It's just, they're starting to remove whole swathes of status quo as we know it now, which has a manufacturing plant producing volumes of tablets that will eventually be moved to a pharmacy, will eventually end up in the hand of a patient. How do we get much more efficient in terms of the consumption of energy to achieve that, but also in terms of the waste? I dread to think, I can't remember the numbers now, the volume of medication that's wasted simply because the patient doesn't finish the prescription or are prescribe what they need. So there's a few examples, I think you're right, where we will, through the technology, become much more efficient in terms of the consumption of materials, and therefore the impact we have on the planet, and therefore ultimately the impact we have on us as human beings.
I have a little anecdote about 3D printing, which is back in 2014, Julian and I worked together on a book called I Disrupted. And as a part of researching that book, I looked into the possibility of 3D printing a car. And it didn't matter. And I spoke to some of the leading experts on 3D printing in the world. I even spoke to someone that won an award for a design for a car developed by a 3D printer. And everyone I spoke to said, forget it. It will never happen. 3D printing a car is impossible. It will never happen. I was a bit disappointed by that because I thought that would be really exciting technology. Well, that was 2014. Within 5 years of that, it has happened. Cars are being 3D printed now. So I think that's a really interesting example of how we underestimate the significance that new technologies are going to have.
Yeah, for sure. As you say, we're living in the age of the jerk. So what we thought was impossible 5 years ago is already a reality.
Yes, absolutely.
And
that's the bit that I think Bill Gates summed up, wasn't he, when he said that we spend, I forget the exact quote, but essentially we spend too much time fretting about the short-term impact of technology innovation and not enough time, being aware of the actual impact of the long term. The quote's much smarter than that, but essentially that we underestimate the speed at which change comes in.
Yeah, it's worse to the effect that we overestimate how quickly the change will occur, but then we underestimate how significant it will be when it occurs. Yeah. And I think when you think about it, if you imagine that, if you take for an example, exponential technology, a technology that's changing exponentially, then that's exactly how exponential works. That's how COVID worked, actually, because I think certainly in the West, a lot of people were quite dismissive about COVID in the early days because they said, well, there's only a few cases. Why are we worrying about it? Well, that's how exponential works. It starts off small, and then suddenly the numbers become huge, and it becomes quite terrifying. And I think exactly the same principle applies to.
So that's an interesting segue to one of the concepts of the book that we try to exploit in the beginning of the book, which is this notion that I think people forget around innovation and the adoption of innovation, and therefore the impact that it has. And I think people underestimate what it takes for technology to be adopted and therefore to have its full effect. And so there's much talk at the moment by many organizations as well as many movements, including, for example, the World Economic Forum, around this whole the fourth industrial revolution. And what Michael and I are paying to trying to explain to people is that yes, we are in an IR4 moment at the moment, but we're really seeing technology innovation being improved and honed and tweaked at a small scale until such point where it is ready to be adopted at a large scale. And so we're very much still in that phase of the small scale, let's call it that, the proof of concept, let's say, to use startup terminology here. And therefore, and Michael loves this terminology because we've had it before, which is, we are fretting now about the impact of that technology. But as Michael would put it in his own words, we ain't seen nothing yet. And what he means by that is when the adoption of this technology really kicks in, that's when we'll start seeing the impact, both positive and negative, which is this utopia dystopia piece that the book is trying to compel to people. And so if we wait for it to start picking up, then it's probably too late. We do really need to start engaging now in that conversation, understanding what it actually means, and start engaging in order to shape that future to the one we want as individuals, not what might happen if we let it sort of just run its course.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
just let me chime in there. Well, let's think of it like what Amazon did to our world, right? So it grew into this monster online retail platform, thereby sucking in all the created wealth by mom and pop shops or even smaller chains of retail stores into the vacuum of Amazon. And when we started it, or when they started it, excuse me, they didn't think about the consequences of what they're doing, right? We didn't think that there's all these retail stores, Macy's and Sears, and all these retail companies go bankrupt in a consequence. We talked about it, but when we let out an idea or let out a technology into this world, we don't think too much about the repercussions of what that technology does, only the dream that we get, right? And then the whole dystopian side of it is never really discussed. And now we're actually starting to see that happening. And
indeed.
when we start, accelerating more of these AIs or blockchain or whatever these technologies are, we haven't really talked about how can we create something new, but at the same time cure what damages it'll cause as well. And I just wanted to know what your opinions are to that, because as we accelerate all these technologies, obviously we don't need people in the equation that much anymore in that sense, right? And people are going to lose jobs. We don't even know what money is anymore potentially. I mean, what do you think?
It's fascinating. No, you're absolutely right. It's fascinating. Let me touch on one of those, and I know Michael's got views on others, etc. The one constant that we know is it to be a constant, and it doesn't matter who you talk to, but certainly we tie to it with the book, and that is, and both the first book and this book, there's no point in resisting it. That technological change, innovation is coming through, whether you like it or not, and therefore it's not about trying to stand in its way. It's around making sure we shape it the outcome we want. Yeah. And so essentially, you've got three groups of people at the moment who are staring at the technology innovation, as you refer to it. Use Amazon, let's use other types of innovation as well. The early adopters, of course, the people like me who love this stuff and will play with it and will contribute to its improvement, let's say, by the fact that I'm happy to early adopt it. Then the swathes of society, that 60%, are somewhat apathetic to it. It's kind of, it doesn't really affect my everyday life. I'm just going to get on with it. But it's it's almost an apathy. What I mean by that is it's almost a lack of intellectual curiosity to understand actually what does it actually mean and how does it impact me or future generations. And of course, you've got your laggards, or those people who are like what we call in the book actually the King Canute moment. In other words, for those familiar with British history, the king who stood on the beach saying the tide will not come in and nearly drowned. There are segments of society, and we see them now in terms of how they're politically voting, for example, who are feeling threatened by this technology move and are trying to block and tackle it. And of course, there are politicians who are trying to echo that to their advantage. But come what may, that technology is coming through. So whether it's happening next year, in 5 years' time, or 10 years' time, it's going to happen. So it's too late to try and address it once it's already knocking out jobs, etc. And I don't know, Michael, if you want to talk about this whole notion of workforce and why this book is so important to employers, to parents, to etc.
Okay, so there's a couple of things that I wanted to say. One's about online shopping, and the other one is about what we can do. being slightly more positive. And the online shopping thing is a little anecdote. A long time ago, I think it was 1993, it might have been 1994. It was before the internet had established itself. It was when Bill Gates was still saying that he doesn't think the internet is where we're going. I don't know if you remember or are aware of that, but Bill Gates was actually quite late to the internet party. I read a report, and it said that what it called online shopping, I think it called it, will have such an impact upon shopping that it will be as if there's a bomb on every high street. I remember thinking, wow, that's extraordinary. And so the whole warning that this is before the internet, it was very early days of the World Wide Web. It may even be before the World Wide Web, actually. The warnings that online shopping was going to take over from physical shopping were there 25 years ago, but there are retailers now that are only just discovering that. They're only just waking up to it. It's taken them 25 years to discover what had. And I think that's partly because people are very cynical. They say, "Oh, I don't believe that. Shopping, it's a social thing. It won't happen." But it did happen, and maybe it didn't happen as quickly as we thought it would, but it has happened, and the impact certainly. I don't know what it's like where you are, but in the UK, the shopping centres are being devastated at the moment. The retailers are just closing down left, right, and centre. So what can we do? Just imagine this scenario in which computers do everything for us. Okay, maybe there'll always be a demand for people who've got very specialist skills as a data scientist or something, but most people won't be able to do that. What jobs will exist for them? And I think that the answer to that lies in who we are, who humans are, because we are fundamentally a social species. We define ourselves by how we interact with other people. We might not mind buying something over the internet, but if we go to a party, we want to interact with people. We don't want to interact with robots. And I think that the jobs that will exist will be the jobs, or let's reword that, the jobs that we want to exist. And there's no guarantee this will happen. We have to manage it correctly. But the jobs that we want to exist are the kind of jobs that play to our social characteristics. So encouraging us to be more sociable. So at one level, it's things like nurses or carers or counsellors, but it could also be, community organisers of a more social nature, people who organise community events and things like that. And I think that will be an area where there will always be a need for people and not machines.
Well, we definitely live in an age of YouTube and Instagram where people actually make money posting their own content, such as this podcast as well, although I'm not making money off of it. But, it created a lot of jobs that never really existed before. I mean, I was talking to a retailer before, and they were talking about, oh, when we try to sell this, we're not going to actually have a physical store. It's going to be online. We're going to pay influencers. And these influencers charge between like $300 to like $1,000 per story that they post out on Instagram. And I'm thinking, it's almost stupid to have a job nowadays if you can have that massive audience and then getting paid $1,000 just for posting one story on your Instagram. And
I think it's interesting if you look at that trend, it's quite interesting. If you look at that and compare it to a parallel in medicine, I think what we're seeing is things becoming more precise. So look at advertising in the past. One large corporation still do it, but one large corporation would basically spend millions creating an advert, and a thing would get played on TV, irrespective of which eyeball's looking at it. So it's kind of, let's throw spaghetti at the wall, see what sticks. The parallel with that is a clinical trial for a new medicine. You select 10,000 people, and you give them the medicine, and you hope that the outcome of that clinical trial is positive for the drug. But you're therefore deciding on the basis of the outcome of 10,000 people what's appropriate for 7.5 billion. Then move forward now to our world now where we are, where advertising, B2C advertising at least, is through influencers. It is through social media. It's much more precise because you know that the eyeballs talking to that influencer are the eyeballs who want to hear. It's the same in medicine. Nowadays, the number of patients who are using devices and therefore collating information around their everyday state of health is in the millions. And therefore, essentially, your clinical trial post-launch, that may change over time, is in the millions of people reporting on their state of health because they're on that particular product, not in the tens of thousands. It's much more precise in terms of the actual outcome of that medicine for the patient. The same sort of thing could be talked about in relation to genomics as well, in terms of really being very precise as to which type of person will respond positively to that drug because you selected them by the actual genomics rather than an average person in the street. So I think we're seeing technology and allowing us to be much more laser focused, but as a result, of course, it's changing the world of advertising from large advertising houses producing one size fits all type campaigns to individuals on the ground. Now, will they aggregate again the other way? I'm not sure, but your point's interesting in terms of looking at it, how this precision, we want to call it, is growing as a result of technology.
Yeah. And also, sorry, on your point about YouTube, and it really is, it's a people thing. And it's amazing what people are making money out of doing on YouTube. There are people out there who are making money watching a movie. So they watch Star Wars or they watch Jaws, and people are watching that movie, and then they're making money through advertising, which is extraordinary, really. And it's because we are a social species. We like to watch other people, and whether it's face to face or it's over the internet, and that's the one area that robots or computers will never do.
Yeah, but there's about 7-8 billion of us, all right, and not all of us can be on YouTube and become stars, make money, or Instagram influencers, and there's so much more of like us to come around to actually create a business just solely focused on our personal brand or whatever it is. So how do we even transition? Because we're talking about like AI and all this acceleration in maybe, let's say, 10 years time or maybe 15 years from now, but there's definitely a timeline gap between now and to there, and then how we can transition ourselves to be skilled differently so that we can meet that the world that we still don't know yet. And it's kind of hard. It's like people say, oh yeah, use your personal brand, build out build a business you want out of your own passion, because now you don't have to do this 9 to 5 soul sucking job that you don't want to do anyway, and that's going to be automated away anyway. So go find your passion. But the thing is, making money off your passion is so damn hard, right? And how do we really get there to say, oh, we can all 7 billion, say 8 billion of us can actually make money just by following our passion?
Well, I think this is one of the reasons. It partly comes down to education, because we've got to be more flexible. It's almost a cliche thing to say that you no longer have a career for life, but it's true. You might have to retrain multiple times throughout your life, and I think that you need to have a flexible mindset, and I think education is very important in that respect. And at the moment, there's almost a backlash against this idea of university education. I think a lot of people sort of questioning why should they have a university education? It's so expensive. But actually, I think that that's more important than ever. It's because if it can teach you a sort of a flexible mind and give you and make you more able to reinvent yourself, if you like. So that's one of the factors.
There is an argument that it says that the education system needs to understand the fact that almost the days of being a specialist in something is leaving you at risk versus being a generalist. And therefore, does, for example, the British education system run most of its output, let's say, at a greater risk because people in the UK specialize from the age of 16 onwards? Essentially, you just do 3 A levels, all on the same topic roughly, and then you move to a university degree, versus, say, the US or the French system, where actually, when you're doing a degree, you tend to do a broader set of topics. So that's an interesting, for me, that's an interesting way of looking at education in terms of, yes, tertiary education is important, but how do you make sure that you're not so narrow that you leave yourself at risk?
I think that's absolutely right, and it's a French baccalaureate system, isn't it? That
beyond,
sort of broader education, and completely, I think that's absolutely right. I think, I don't know what the rest of the world is like. I know what the education system's like in the UK, and we specialize too soon.
Yeah, in
And of
Japan,
course,
it does follow a little
it's
bit
a
like the
cliche
US.
thing to say, but you carry on learning after school.
Yeah, in Japan, we kind of follow the same
Does
type
it?
of
Right.
American system where we do a little bit of broader topics in the first 2 years, and then we specialize a lot more in the latter 2 years. I took political science, and a lot of it was like theory, and it was all theory, and it was nothing really tangibly useful for the real world and get out there and become actually a politician or something. So I feel like the institution itself is not really the problem, but it's like how you teach things is going to be more of the problem, right? And because knowledge is so accessible, we have the internet, we have Wikipedia. I mean, you could learn anything from the internet now because we completely uploaded all of our human knowledge into the World Wide Web now. That education should be more about connecting the dots rather than learning about those dots.
Yeah,
there's one thing to bear in mind with education, and I think Michael and I have debated this at some length, which is we've got, hopefully we can start moving away from a one type of education model, and hopefully COVID is accelerating that into one that's much more flexible in terms of how do you actually get educated wherever you are, back to your 7.5 billion people. But the other, of course, why is the onus of education always placed on the government and the education machine of that government? Why do we listen to employers, be they small and large, regularly complain around the fact that the output from the education system is it's not got the right skill set, there's a talent war, etc., etc. And therefore, I think there needs to be a greater onus placed on the overall contribution of corporations, or more specifically employers, with respect to society, and how they, as organizations, play a much greater role in terms of shaping society so that it is ready for the future, rather than bemoaning the fact that it may not be or will not be down the road.
I think also, you've got some amazing educational facilities out there the internet's made available, such as the Khan Academy or whatever, and all of a sudden people can have access to the best teachers in the world. I think your traditional teacher, the teachers that we had when we were at school, they have to, the main thing that they need to try and get across to pupils is to inspire them and to make them want to learn, rather than teach them facts. You don't need to know facts anymore. You can look up anything, and but what you do need to do is teach people to want to learn. It's one of the great sort of paradoxes, I suppose, that we're wandering around with these smartphones and we have access to the greatest library that has ever existed, and we have fake news. You can fact check anything, and yet people believe any old rubbish. It's just crazy, and that's got to be an educational thing, I think, or education can play a role in that anyway.
Yeah, it's intellectual curiosity. Sorry, keep going.
Well, I think there's too much trust in what's on the internet, right? Because we believe it's going to be true. So why do we have Google? And most of the people don't even go through the second or third page of Google. They just click on the first top three and then believe that's true. Yeah.
But why is that though? Why do we? Since when do we trust what's on the internet? Do we trust what is told to us on TV? I mean, surely it's been years, decades that we should no longer trust it.
But it's not just the internet, though, is it? I mean, politicians seem to lie through their teeth more than they used to me. Maybe that's in my.
Let them get away with it.
Maybe that's in my imagination, but it seems to me that politicians do get away with saying stuff which is just completely not true. And I don't think they would have got away with that a few years ago. And yet we could fact check it. It's not difficult to find out whether it's true or not. And I think, and the media, it's what the traditional media. I live in the UK, and unfortunately, in the UK, we have some pretty awful newspapers, to be honest with you, and they talk absolute nonsense, and it's rubbish, and people believe it because they don't fact check it, and I think that's
we never been brought up doubting what's on the textbook or doubting what the teacher tells you, right? So I think we're not
No.
really geared to question authority and say, no, I think that's wrong because of how we're grown up in this education system that we have.
That certainly has to be the first step, doesn't it? I mean, if we are about shaping our future, if we are about not wanting to open the dystopia door, to use our analogy in the book, the first step surely must be around having that intellectual curiosity of looking into something, understanding it, rather than mind-numbingly following what a politician or what a Hollywood star or whatever says to you. I'm thinking of the anti-vaxxers movement. I'm thinking of some of the political themes we're hearing. But we need to address that. I think was it Goering or was it Goebbels, wasn't it, whose definition of propaganda was, just say the right things to the non-intellectual class, because that's where you'll get your movement. The intellectual class generally is very lazy and apathetic, or something along those lines. And so there really is a need to instigate that in terms of getting that understanding and asking those questions. And to some extent, we hope the book is going to contribute, let's say, at least to pushing people into asking those questions, and taking ownership for their future rather than bemoaning the outcome.
Yeah, I think one thing that we should really fact check also is the constant, theories that we always hear about the trickle down effect of capitalism, right? And
sure.
There was a economist back in the days called Simon Kuznets that actually kind of came up with the whole GDP and the Kuznets curve, while saying that when capitalism thrives, the inequalities initially goes down, but eventually it kind of evens itself out in the end. And I think he only probably looked at a very small set of facts to come to that Kuznets curve. Because if you actually probably look at the history of what happened since his time until now, I think we've seen something like this, right? And we haven't really been able to question why capital isn't working for us. Maybe it's because it's manipulated. It's not really a free capitalist society as well. And this is something that you talk about also in your book, is about inequalities that are rising, and how we're going to look at that through the incoming of this massive wave of technology, that it will be so disinflationary for our economic situation as well. So how do we kind of start to address these problems?
Okay, so in the again, from a Western perspective in Europe, and indeed this is the case in the United States as well, the period in history in which these economies enjoyed their most rapid period of growth ever was a period when inequality was relatively low. So we're talking about the 50s, 60s, and the early 70s. These were the boom years in Europe and the US, and inequality steadily fell throughout those periods.
Yeah.
So and the trickle down argument was, there's something in trickle down, but I don't think it's not the whole story. There is. You want to encourage enterprise, you want to encourage wealth creation and young entrepreneurs and so on. But if you rely purely on the idea of trickle down, then I think you have a problem. And during the 50s and 60s and 70s, we didn't rely purely. There was the certainly in the UK, and I think throughout most of Europe, there was a much more social support for people than there is today. And that's largely because we had a reaction against that in the late 70s and in the 1980s with Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, and we had neoliberalism, which has led to the tyranny, if you like, of the trickle down philosophy, and there's no evidence to suggest that the economy does do better when we rely purely on unfettered competition. You want to have competition, you want to have capitalism, but I think you can have too much.
I mean, I think it's compounded by the fact that trickle down capitalism is fine until capitalism has a minor heart attack. So 2008, this to me is clearly a case of where capitalism had a minor heart attack, largely because regulators stood out of the way, and then allowed certain behaviors in the financial system to get out of control. But the solution to that was for governments to step in and then bail the system out. Essentially, a wealth redistribution taking place from Joe Average paying his taxes to the elite and corporations of society. And so it's taken, I know, Michael, you know these numbers better than I do, but it's taken probably just about at the COVID point for the system, essentially from an employment perspective, from a wealth is probably not the right way to look at it, to more or less return to where it was, pre-2008, 2008. Now, Michael will probably correct that. It's probably not 100% right. But COVID is only adding more to that in terms of that phenomenal wealth redistribution. All of that funding that governments are throwing at the economy to keep it alive will only be able to be underwritten one way, and that's by the taxpayer again. And therefore, that means, Joe Average having to yet give more of their wealth to the ecosystem, to the economy as a whole. So trickle down's fine, but unfortunately, it has to be governed, as I think Michael's trying to say. But we also need to be watchful of the fact that when it gets out of control, there's a great deal more wealth going the other way, in my opinion, anyway.
But I also think if technology creates this sort of age of plenty, and we do have the ability to produce way more goods and services than we actually need, then it would be crazy if we turn around and had a very high unemployment, a lot of poverty. Well, that's ridiculous. So we can solve. It's almost a question of not being stupid. It's a question of the government saying, no, we can solve this problem because there's easily enough resources out there to meet our needs. It's a structural problem with the economy, and Julie and I have discussed this many times, but the question is there's quite an important issue, is what's going to happen to inflation over the next 10, 15 years. Is a consequence of the bailouts of COVID, is it going to lead to runaway inflation, hyperinflation, in which case we've got a problem, because last time that happened in a significant way in Europe, we had a world war as a consequence? Or will instead we get the opposite? Will we get deflation? Now, my own view is that we're more likely to get deflation than inflation. And if we get deflation, then we see all kinds of opportunities to kick the economy along through creating money, because you can do that if we've got deflation. But if we've got hyperinflation, then all of a sudden your arms are tied, and there's not much you can do other than slam on the brakes.
Yeah, I think inflation at this point, especially for developed countries, is a matter of psychology and whether people are really worried about this growth of indebtedness of sovereign nations around the G7s and so on. I mean, Europe, U.S., Japan in particular have net debt to GDP over 100. I mean, Japan has like 260. So it is difficult for them to say, there's not going to be inflation when you're still having this kind of debt hanging in our economies. However, technology is also deflationary, and in psychology of the crowd is saying, well, we're not really feeling this growth in our economy. Where is this inflation really coming from? I mean, we're in a complete secular stagnation at the moment. In the past 10 years, I mean, we've hardly seen any growth of our economies. And while you see so much productivity happening, Amazon FANGs are making so much money, but at the same time, we're not getting wealthier, wages not growing. So, like, what is happening here?
Well, there's economists, you probably know, there's an economist in the US called Robert Gordon, who's based in Northwestern University, which I believe is in Chicago. And he argues that that's because technology ain't what it used to be. And he says it's because technological progress has slowed down, therefore productivity has slowed down. And that's a real reason why you've got the problems that you just described. I would say that it's slightly different from that, which is there has actually, the period we're in, there are time lags between innovation and the impact upon the economy. And I think the fourth industrial revolution is massively significant. And in the book, Julian and I talk about the fifth industrial revolution, which we think will be even more significant. But these things don't happen suddenly. You have the innovation, but it can take years for that to have an impact upon the economy. So where I think Robert Gordon is mistaken is this assumption that it's a permanent problem. And I don't think it's a permanent problem. I think it's a matter of time lags. There's a time lag between innovation and the impact on the economy. And this isn't new. It's always been like that. It happened after the first industrial revolution. Industrial revolution, time lag, economic growth. Second industrial revolution, a long time lag, economic growth. Third industrial revolution, which was the IT revolution, time lag, economic growth. So we're in the middle of the fourth industrial revolution. It's too soon for it to impact upon the economy. But I do think it will happen.
But the watch out here is I mean, Michael and I do more or less rely on that. We don't believe there's inflation short term. I think if there is, it's going to be medium to long term. Short term is definitely stagnation, if not deflation. But the watch out, I think the economy, or more specifically the corporations and organizations, as they try and come out of the dip, whether it's a V, a U, a W, a whoosh, or whatever, are going to be investing in technology and fast tracking a number of their technology adoption plans in order to significantly improve the productivity of their businesses. That will have a negative impact on employment in terms of the re-employment of these people, unless these people are able to reskill fast, which we know is not necessarily the case. And so, inflation really is linked to there being a consumer at the other end. That's what we're saying, able to spend money. But if that permanent environment of uncertainty continues to reign, we're more likely to see savings than we are spending. And so I think that's the watch out in terms of the benefits of technology.
Okay. I think in the longer term, you mentioned just now secular stagnation. I think in the long term, we've got two conflicting forces, because at the moment, I think savings are quite high around the world, certainly in Asia, but in Germany and across a lot of Europe, mainly I think, and certainly in Japan, because of the demographics, because people are aging, they know they're going to be retiring soon, and they haven't saved enough money. Equities haven't performed very well for the last 20 years. Oh, I need to save more. And that, I think, is one of the underlying reasons why we've had very, very low inflation. Where I'm not clear is what will happen when those people are no longer saving because they're worried about their retirement, but they've actually retired. Because when you retired, you're not saving, you're drawing down on your savings. So theoretically, there could come a time, maybe in 10 years' time, when I suppose the baby boomer generation has fully retired, when you might find that you'll have dis-savings, people start drawing upon their savings, which could have an inflationary effect. But counter to that, you've got technology, because I think by the time that happens, we really will be seeing the impact of the fourth industrial revolution. So I think you have two conflicting forces at play there. So I think that'd be quite sort of an interesting one to watch, really. But I don't think people have fully considered the implications of what will happen when all these people who are busy saving because they're worrying about the fact they're getting older are actually older and they're retired and now they're drawing down upon their savings. We've not been here before. That's new grounds. I don't think ever in the history of humanity have we had that problem before.
Yeah, I think a lot of the and people in the investment world talk a lot about people selling down on various investment asset classes because these baby boomers are drawing down all their money and they don't want to put it into long-term bonds or these very volatile markets in the equity markets, and therefore that there could be a potential huge crash in the market. Whereas now you're talking about baby boomers probably have maybe 10, 20, 30 years more left. But what about the younger generation who are in their 40s and below, where they're actually eating scrap, right? They're not going to be as wealthy as their previous generations were. And there's so much talk about UBI in the world now. Andrew Yang was talking about in a presidential election, and now that we're in post-COVID, everybody's talking about UBI now, which is amazing. But is this something that you think is going to be some kind of reality? Because of course we are in the kind of dip where there's a transitional moment where a lot of people are going to be displaced, and we do need that social welfare to carry through to the huge potential growth that we'll see in the economy. And until we get there, there needs to be some kind of bridge to get us there.
Okay, so I'm a fan of Andrew Yang. I think he's great, and I'm really disappointed that he pulled out of the election race as soon as he did. I mean, Julie and I don't think we can. We one of the things we try to say with the book is join the debate, and that means you can have different opinions. And I don't think Julie and I are completely aligned on the topic of universal basic income. Of course, in the UK, we don't have universal basic income, but we have a universal basic service, which is the National Health Service. So it's not necessarily UBI. It could be universal basic services instead, such as health or food vouchers, for example. So recently in the UK, an organisation called the Resolution Foundation put forward this proposal to kickstart the economy by giving every man and woman, every adult, every man and woman in the UK, a £500 voucher. What's that? $700, only exchangeable at physical retailers and at restaurants and pubs and cafes. The idea to try and kickstart that side of the economy. Now, I'm not sure they were right there, because to me it seems they're trying to save an industry, the retail industry, which is in decline. Why? That's a King Canute idea, I think. But the idea of giving people vouchers which could only be exchangeable in certain ways, that could be an alternative to universal basic income.
Julian, yeah.
No,
Vouchers, education vouchers, health vouchers,
Yeah, my concern is the applicability of UBI. I understand its merits. At the end of the human being is the human being, and we have a specific set of needs, be they self-respect, be they rewards for our hard work. And so how does UBI go to address those, which are, they're intangibles, but they're important to the welfare, happiness, etc. of that individual. And so where do you set UBI, and how do you make UBI work when at this stage, certainly human beings want the latest gadget, human beings want the nice comfortable house, etc., etc. That's where I struggle with the notion.
Well, because one of the scenarios we look at in the book is the scenario that technology kind of makes us lazy and it makes life too easy for us, which I think is we look at 8 different ways it could pan out, and that's and they're not mutually exclusive. We could have them all, or we could have some of them, but certainly that would be one danger, and I suppose UBI would be connected with that. On the other hand, it could act as a massive economic stimulus. And one of the problems I think that we've had with UBI up to now is there have been tests, there have been experiments with it, but they've been applied to people picked out at random. Oh, so that person will have it and see. But the economic benefits of doing UBI are lost because there's no economic stimulus as a result. What would be interesting would be to apply it in a region that's quite run down, where unemployment's quite high, and see what impact that would have upon the economy. It might be that it would kick life into the economy.
Potentially. Or, if we're talking about, let's find a job that keeps us really passionate about our lives, then we need some kind of fallback if that doesn't make us money. But if that's the only type of jobs left to do, then maybe we do need some kind of financial support to at least get by, our daily necessities. That's a kind of a thought I have.
Yeah. Indeed.
And towards the end of your book, you mentioned very quickly and maybe like a very short 2 paragraphs about how to overcome the indebtedness of sovereign countries. And you used the equation PT equal MV, which I thought it was pretty interesting. A very simple solution that you mentioned, but you never really got into real depth of that, which I would like to really understand more.
So PTMV is the Irvine-Fisher equation, and it's a very simple equation, which I don't think any economist denies is true, although there's argument about how important it is. And what it says is that average price times the number of transactions equals the amount of money in circulation times the velocity of circulation. When I did it at university, it was P equals MV over T, which is average price equals money times velocity divided by transactions. So the equation there, so one of the, after the 2008, central banks hit the money, well, it was, the press described them as having hit the money press with quantitative easing. But the consequence of that wasn't necessarily an increase in the money supply, because we have a fiat money system in the West, and the money supply grows through banks lending money to each other. So it's all very well the central banks going on and buying government bonds, but unless there's a corresponding increase in borrowing, lending from banks, the broad money supply doesn't actually increase. So we don't get inflation. So that's why, despite quantitative easing, we didn't have inflation post 2008, even though lots of people argued that we would have. And those same people are making the same arguments now, by the way. They were completely proven wrong after 2008, and now they're making the same arguments. Now, because this crisis isn't the same as 2008, it's different. 2008 was a crash on banks, and it was about credit being squeezed, and it was a hit on consumer demand. This crisis is a hit on demand and supply. But the answer to your question, so if you take as an example autonomous cars and the sharing economy, so if we have less cars in order to meet our transport needs, then the velocity of money would decline. We wouldn't need to spend as much money in order to fulfill our needs. So that would be deflationary. So in such a scenario, it would be possible to create money without there being inflation, because one part of the equation's gone down. So you can even it out that way. So that's kind of how it works.
I guess also the population decline also contributes to that as well, because you have less people actually spending money at the same time as well. I guess part of it, I think in Japan, I do find that, it's been 20 plus years in deflationary environment, and yet we haven't seen any type of inflation kick in. And I think that's partially have to do with, the decline in population, and then all this technological advancements where we don't need to spend as much money as before. I don't know if that perfectly matches to the theory that you were talking about, but it seems quite similar in that sense.
I think that, look, demographics in Japan is a warning to us all. What the problems that Japan have had really since 1990. They called it the lost decade, the 1990s, and it's been 3 lost decades. And I'm pretty sure that demographics is 90% of the explanation for that. I'm pretty sure of that. Yeah. And we're going that way in Europe now. As it happens, in the UK and the US, that demographic problem is a little bit further away, I think. In the UK, the population is still increasing. But certainly in lots of Europe, many parts of Europe, Italy, Eastern Europe, Russia, they've got a massive demographic problem that's forming now. And I believe it's a similar story in Asia as well. China, there is, but maybe it's a couple of decades. Maybe they're a couple of decades away from where Japan is. But there is a demographic issue in the making. The other day, I was looking at the figures on demographics for Malaysia and how the fertility rate in Malaysia has just dropped below the replacement level. So it's as that generation of people who are currently having children eventually start dying, then you'll see a rapid decline in the population. But before we see a decline in the population, you'll see people become aware of the issue, and then they'll start saving more, and so on and so forth. So demographics is a massive issue, absolutely huge. And the only solution, there are 2 possible solutions to that. One would be immigration, for people to migrate from areas where the population is still rising very, very rapidly, which unfortunately is proving to be very politically unpopular at the moment. And the other solution to that is technology. So practically, technology is the only solution, it seems, to the problem of demographics, because unfortunately people's views about immigration are not particularly where we need them to be in order for the immigration to solve the problem.
At the same time, I always thought that because we're going into this AI world and automation, we don't need as many people as we had before, because we don't need many people to be in factories and farming and all these labor intensive things that, or manual labor intensive jobs that robots can do for us now.
Yeah.
So maybe it is better that we see actually a decline in population, just for that very fact that we can tackle a lot of social problems.
You could be right. You could be right. I mean, it might be a good thing. The demographics thing. If we get the timing right and it coincides with automation and all these robots and AI, etc., it may actually be perfect. It may be perfect.
Right. Well, I think I could talk on and on with you guys.
Indeed.
I'm having such a wonderful time talking to you. Maybe we could even do a part 2 of this sometime down the line again.
And don't forget the Is that upside down? It's upside down, isn't it?
Not. No,
it looks upside down the way I'm holding it. Are you seeing that the right way around there?
A little bit up.
Yeah.
There you go. Yes.
Okay, there you go.
I'll definitely put that in the show notes and
Brilliant.
and links to all your social media and other places that you like to be found. Please send me something that I can show it to everybody else. But right now, I mean, what else? Is there any parting comments that you want to say just before we end the conversation?
I think the issue of technology and how it's changing is really important. The last 20 years has been. We've seen an awful lot of disruption over the last 20 years, good and bad. You've seen the rise of the techs. All of a sudden, the four largest tech companies in the world are worth $5 trillion. You've seen the decline in online retail. You've seen the rise in political extremism, polarization. You've seen increased inequality. You ain't seen nothing yet. It's going to become more significant over this decade, and probably even more significant over the decade after that. And we have to face up to what's causing that and understand that. And what we don't want to do is bury our heads in the sand and say, "Oh no, I don't believe it. I don't believe that technology is going to have that much impact." Well, it is. And if you're going to go around denying it, then by the time the issue is too late to deal, by the time you face up to the truth, it'd be too late to deal with it.
No, that's the key. It's not to leave it too late when the pathway has been forged and you can't get out of it. We need to shape that now, and that's what we're trying to contribute to. We know we won't single-handedly achieve that, but we hope that those people who have at least the intellectual curiosity of picking the book off the shelf, if only motivated by the double entendre of the title, then we'll have achieved something. But it is around joining the debate, and what we're hoping is that people, having read the book, start wanting to contribute to that debate. And we hope that through social media, which can be a double-edged sword, that social media, that is, that we get that debate and we get that opinion being shaped towards taking the ownership away from politicians and elite, because we run a grave risk if we let that happen.
Right. Thank you very much for your time, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Hopefully,
pleasure.
Thank
you very much.
Enjoy this as well. Thank you. Hi, this is your host Takatoshi Shibayama. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. Now, if you enjoyed or disliked the show, please let me know by writing in the comment section. The only way I can improve or add value to you is through your voices. If there are any topics that you would like me to pick up, please also let me know in the comments. I'd love to start chatting with you all. And if you would like to continue watching the show, please subscribe. Thank you.